We should actually go full Costanza and call each other the moops. Right? Matter of opinion. Oh, I'm sorry. The card says moops.
Moops. From New York Times Opinion, I'm Lydia Polgreen.
I'm Michelle Cottle.
I'm Ross Douthat.
And I'm Carlos Lozada.
And this is Matter of Opinion. So, when I saw last week's special counsel report on Biden and all the reaction that followed, paired with Trump, of course, facing dozens and dozens of felony charges, it really made me realize how much this election is going to revolve around the question of fitness. So I really wanted to ask you guys, yes or no? Do you think either Trump or Biden is fit to be president? Who wants to go first?
I mean, Biden is fit to be president right now. Yeah. Trump hasn't been fit to be president ever.
I'm concerned about both of them, to be honest. Let's just say they're not as fit as I would want them to be. But if they are unfit, it is for very different reasons.
Ross?
No, neither Trump nor Biden are fit to be president under the terms that we would understand presidential fitness prior to the last 8 years.
Yeah. So let's unpack what we mean when we talk about presidential fitness, not just with Trump and Biden, but historically. At the most basic level, what do we expect of the president? And is there even a way to say what's typical or normal in this office? We talk a lot about the new normal, and I feel like I've had to get used to a lot of different new normals. But yeah, what do you all think was the last normal presidency that you would have as a baseline?
I kind of dispute the premise. I mean, I think almost all the presidencies have been normal. I think even Trump could arguably have been horrible, but normal, right up until he decided to try and prevent the peaceful transfer of power. I think after he lost, it went off the rails in a way that is not normal by any definition, even though he was on his way out the door. But Obama, George W., Clinton, Reagan, George H.W., these were all normal. Biden's normal.
That's interesting.
Doesn't mean he needs to be reelected, but it does mean that he's normal.
I would dispute the premise as well, but for the opposite reason. I think if you ask any president, if you could summon them all back, I think they would all think that their presidency presented unique complications and circumstances that rendered it abnormal. And I think let's just go back a little bit from...
Oh my God, are we going to Carter?
No, we're not going to Carter. We're not going to Carter. So Biden, right? Oldest president ever, dealing with global pandemic, predecessor who declares him illegitimate, right? Those are somewhat abnormal circumstances. Trump, impeached twice. One acknowledges defeat. There's plenty more, but that'll do for abnormality. Obama, first black president, which was itself a very unique circumstance, taking office under a catastrophic economic crisis. Bush comes to office in very complicated circumstances involving the Supreme Court. Major terrorist attack, launches 2 massive wars. Clinton, impeached for lying about a sexual relationship with an intern. The Starr Report was not normal. I think you have to go back to George H.W. Bush to find a presidency that feels vaguely normal. There was a war, but it was a small one. There was a recession, but it was a short one. A former VP succeeding his boss. That all seems pretty normal. But if you have to go back, Biden, Trump, Obama, Bush, Clinton, 6 presidents to find kind of a normal
He's
a
the one
normal
who
term.
only served one term.
Yeah, then our premise seems off.
People were tired of it.
May be what is actually common.
Interesting. Yeah. I don't know. Ross, would you agree? Do you have a different perspective?
Well, I think in terms of what we're talking about here, we're talking specifically about the capacities of the chief executive. So I agree with Carlos that there's no such thing in recent years as sort of a perfectly normal presidency. And indeed, I think the world has been getting sort of progressively weirder in various ways with every president since Clinton. So in that sense, yeah, some kind of normalcy is inherently out of reach. But when we're talking about Trump and Biden, I think we're talking about sort of the everyday capacities of the chief executive, right? Your confidence that they are reading briefing books and holding, normal policy meetings and having a sort of normal policy process. And I think obviously in that sense, Trump was unusually abnormal. And then in Biden's case, it's a little bit different. I think we assume that sort of there are more normal policy processes in the presidency. But Biden again, people dispute this, but I think it is just sort of palpably diminished in the public-facing part of the presidential role, right? And it's basically a case where, we've had diminished presidents before, but it's usually in a particular context. It's Reagan in the last years of his second term. It's Woodrow Wilson after his stroke. It's maybe Nixon during Watergate. And with Biden, it's just been sort of pretty consistent. But I also think, to agree with Michelle, that both presidencies have proven at various points that it's quite possible to run a fairly normal-seeming White House around a president who lacks some of the capacities that we took for granted in chief executives. And that itself is instructive.
Yeah, I think that's right. And I think that gets to another thing that's been on my mind, which is, what exactly is the modern presidency? There is this kind of internal functioning versus the external part of the job that I think, as you were saying, Ross, actually highlights some of the core issue here. I personally have a tremendous amount of confidence in Biden as a kind of internal operator of that office and to be able to manipulate the sort of levers of the presidency within the walls of the White House. But that other part of the job, which is this kind of projection outward, is a place where I think there is a real sense of weakness. But I'm curious, how do you guys think the way in which the presidency has shifted and changed along with the other branches of the government has sort of changed the nature of this question of what presidential fitness looks like?
Well, with the forward-facing part of the job, that is often underestimated in terms of how important that is. People are like, oh, well, you want a smart president, you want a policy wonk, you want a whatever. No, actually, the president is, for all intents and purposes, America's daddy. At some point, it might be America's mommy, God willing. But so much of it in the modern presidency with TV is a PR job. I think part of the problem, at least on the Democratic side, is that an entire generation was ruined by the television show West Wing. They somehow think the president is supposed to be like this, soaring rhetoric, perfect moral, let's all get stuff done. And the White House is a bunch of earnest people. One guy sits down and writes a State of the Union. I feel like there was some kind of warping that was done there that's still going on, where everybody has some kind of unrealistic vision of what the White House and the presidency are like. And I understand that was a particular point in time, but I do think it's absurd.
No, I think that's right. That's actually a really good point. We have this set of expectations of what we think the president should be. But, I do think it's worth thinking about, when we look back and we think about successful presidencies, what are the characteristics that they have?
But what do we consider successful? George W. Bush's presidency was considered unsuccessful by Republicans. Obama disappointed his progressives, but I don't think it was quite the resounding failure that Bush's was seen to be. Clinton, he had the unfortunate impeachment because he couldn't keep his pants zipped. FDR and Reagan were the models for people who managed to transform the idea of what their parties were altogether. But that can't be the model because that's so rare. When you're talking about success, what is it? H.W. didn't get reelected again, but that seems a pretty narrow version of failure.
I think that's an important part, right? I think a really successful president has to be reasonably popular, not insanely popular, but reasonably popular, has to not have his party collapse under his tenure, and should leave office, not wading through catastrophic defeats. So by that measure, Reagan looks quite successful, George W. Bush looks quite unsuccessful, and Obama is more successful than Bush and less successful than Reagan.
Well, it's interesting and striking that the two one-term presidents of our lifetimes until Trump came along were not one-term presidents out of horrific incompetence necessarily. I think there were, honorable men who mastered the details and had a lot of preparation for the job, but both of them failed to get reelected for not entirely different reasons.
The vision thing.
The vision thing.
The
vision thing. So, yeah,
Carlos,
sorry,
that is your opening for Carter, incidentally.
I don't know why you think I want to talk about Jimmy Carter.
He's history's greatest monster.
There's no single formula, right, for what makes a successful presidency. And I think even those models, while I agree that often presidents come in with a thought of how they're going to govern, like reality takes over. And the things that they thought they were ready for are not necessarily the things that come and hit them one Tuesday morning in September. So, like, yes, it helps to have a great team of advisors and, seasoned cabinet officers, but you can just look at the advisors and cabinet members that led us into Vietnam or led us into Iraq, right? To know that there's no guarantee of that. Like, it's great to have congressional majorities, but, Jimmy Carter had that and struggled to get things done. They didn't even get along. You could say that having even popular opinion on your side is good, but Clinton was impeached during a second term where he had consistently high approval ratings. So there are no formulas, really. Like, when I think of the presidency, like when you're a manager and you're trying to fill a job, you can either pick someone who's like perfect for that job, for like the particular thing you think you want in that job, or someone who will just be good in your organization and can do a lot of different things. Always go with the versatility, because you never know what you're going to be needing from that person, in the moment. You think you want a president for one reason, but then it turns out you need that president to lead you in a completely different circumstance.
Now, one of the interesting things that Trump always promised coming in was that he was going to hire the best people. He didn't have a lot of experience, which he sold as a plus, but he was going to hire all the best people to come in and do the nitty-gritty. Now, what he wound up doing was having massive turnover and a lot of actings and having a complete dumpster fire of an administration, especially early on. But that does speak to the whole idea that the presidency relies on all of these functionaries and all of these appointees to do a lot of the nitty-gritty. And you don't really have to be a policy wonk or know all of the levers.
Right. I mean, in the end, a lot of the Trump presidency ended up turning on the actions of, amid the turmoil, the actions of a few key hires. It made a big difference when John Kelly was chief of staff. He really seemed to stabilize the Trump White House. It made a big difference that Steve Mnuchin, who, everyone was sort of baffled, right, by his appointment, but he ended up staying through the entire Trump presidency and managing the ultimately fairly successful Trump portion of the response to COVID. So the Kelly Mnuchin presidency was in a way much more successful than anyone would have expected, based on some of the chaos around those figures.
Yeah, and I think that sort of brings us back to this question of health. I mean, one could argue that Trump is just sort of like temperamentally incapacitated. And, Ross here basically arguing that like with the right people around him, like you could actually have pretty decent outcomes. But there have been moments in history where there have been presidents who've been really seriously incapacitated. Some of them are, long ago in the past, like Woodrow Wilson. He had a stroke. His wife, Edith, some might argue that she was our first female president. But I think it's
unelected Edith Wilson running the government, which
yes.
is not a good thing for the practice of democracy.
No, but there are also, obviously FDR didn't want people to know that he was unable to walk unaided and so on. And of course, he was in very, very poor health before he ran for his fourth term. There were multiple problems with it, including the fact that he was running for a fourth term. Right. But John F. Kennedy with his Addison's disease, and more recently, obviously, the attempted assassination of Ronald Reagan. There was a projection that Reagan was fine and running the presidency from his hospital bed. But we later learned that he was actually quite a bit more incapacitated than we actually knew. And so, we do have some like recent examples of health being like a really big live question, although it seems like we learn about it a little bit too late in the game.
Well, Trump's case of COVID was actually he was much iller and closer to death than we thought at the time.
It's not just that health impairs them from being able to do their job, is that the way they respond to health problems is often by hiding, by lying, by equivocating, by concealing from the public what is actually going on. And that, to me, is just as concerning as the fact that, maybe for a certain period of time they weren't well.
Right. You've never had a sort of clear, successful devolution of authority from an incapacitated president to someone else. In the 25th Amendment, which is designed for the temporary or permanent removal of a incapacitated president, you were supposed to have this kind of mechanism for how this is supposed to happen. But it has never effectively happened in anything like that way. You have the behind-the-scenes scramble around Reagan, with Al Haig allegedly shouting, "I'm in charge," right? You have, the late Nixon period with, again, supposedly Henry Kissinger and others effectively working around a sort of hard-drinking, despairing president. You have the petticoat government, as it was called, of Edith Wilson. Again, the shadow that hangs over an aged president, or especially, I think, an aged candidate for president, is in a way the sort of total unknowability of what happens if frailty turns into total incapacitation.
Well, that's one of the things you're seeing on the campaign trail is people are okay. They were okay with the idea that Biden was going to come in for 4 years and serve as a bridge, as he put it. And they're fine with how he is now for the most part, but they are not confident that he can run a hard campaign and then do another 4 years.
Right.
And some people are quite angry about this. Even people who voted for him and thinks he's done a great job as president are like, no, not another 4 years of this. It's too risky.
Yeah, I mean, there was a 2019 HuffPost YouGov survey that found that 44% of registered voters said that Biden's age would make it difficult for him to serve effectively, right? But if you look at the Times Siena poll from 2023, it found that 71% of battleground state voters believed that he was too old to be president. So there's clearly been some shifting in that thinking over the course of his presidency, and we'll get into that after the break. And we're back. Before the break, we talked a lot about the idea of a normal presidency and looked at the past for examples. Now I want to return to the present and look a little bit more closely at the Trump and Biden presidencies. So, how do you think Biden and Trump have shaped the office?
I think they have completed a process that was already begun under Bush and Obama and sort of killed off the president as sort of unifier in chief, where there was let's say in the television age, especially the radio age too, there was a sense of the president as the figure who appeared at times of national crisis. And in times of national crisis, most people were expected to rally to and support the president who could be, in some sense, a little bit above partisanship. But I think the distinction with Trump and Biden is that neither of them have really even been able to try to play that role. Trump, for reasons of sort of temperament and style, has always just presented himself as the tribune of one aggrieved half of America against the other. Biden, I think, a little bit in 2020 was able to fill the role, saying, we're going to return to normalcy after Trump. But his diminishment, his inability to sort of just be out there, right, and sort of play that role, it just seems like that role just seems kind of dead. Maybe someone can bring it back, but it seems dead to me right now.
I don't think that Biden has done much to change the role. I mean, he's operated as a pretty standard president. I mean, he's even tried to get Congress to move forward with bipartisan agreements, and he has, in some cases, been pretty successful. I think Trump's inclination has clearly been to try and amass more power under the executive, and the plan that we've all been hearing about if he gets another term is to accelerate that and remake the government such that all of the guardrails that he found frustrating last time around will be removed now that he knows how it operates. So I think it's clear that he has a sense of what he'd like to do if he's given another opportunity, and it is all in that direction.
I would agree with Michelle on the Biden front. I think that even if some of the legislation that has been passed and some of the policies we may think are transformative for the country, I don't think they're transformative for the presidency. This gets back to the sort of West Wingification of presidential politics that Michelle raised. But I think when we look back on presidencies, we think about these moments of soaring rhetoric. What I find interesting about Trump is that he takes those kind of performative elements of the presidency and seems to think that that's almost all there is. His presidency felt like an extension of his campaign rallies. Sue Hennessey and Ben Wittes wrote a good book about this called Unmaking the Presidency. And where they explored this, and they concluded that for Trump, the presidency was really not about, as much as now people think it's going to be, sort of managing the bureaucracy or achieving key, legislative or policy goals, but about showmanship, about flamboyance, about keeping his audience entertained.
He really loved those parades. So many parades.
One of the things that I've noticed about Trump, and when he sort of like flubs something or misspeaks, because that's a thing that a lot of people have accused Biden of doing. But one of the things that I've noticed is that sometimes his bizarre statements often seem more like Freudian slips than poor memory, like saying that he defeated Barack Obama rather than Hillary Clinton. Like I think that like in his imagination, perhaps he thinks of defeating Barack Obama as being more worthy of his greatness. Or sometimes they're like strategic, like confusing Nikki Haley with Nancy Pelosi. Like that does not do any favors to Nikki Haley with the Republican electorate. But there is this way in which like Trump somehow, as he clearly has just done to me, convinces you to think that he's like crazy like a fox. Whereas with Biden, it just sort of feels like he's always been gaffe prone, but it does feel like substantively different. And yeah, I'm curious what you guys think.
It's also important to remember that people like us and a lot of the kind of chattering class care a lot more about how eloquently these guys speak. I mean, Newt Gingrich was not wrong on some level when he praised Trump for speaking at a level that like a fifth grader could understand. And I remember this back during the campaign between Al Gore and George W. Bush. I mean, Bush was famous for Bushisms, which were just kind of misspeaking or flubbing something. And Gore was obviously kind of much wonkier and more articulate and things like that. And people hated that. He was such the nerd. It was like he was talking down to them. And if there is one thing that the American electorate cannot abide, it is a politician talking down to them or sounding like he is talking down to them. So Trump not being able to make a coherent speech plays pretty well in a lot of corners, or at least doesn't really bother people. I mean, it bothers me, but it doesn't bother most people.
Part of the issue here that we're going to end up litigating as this insane campaign heats up is how much has each man changed over the last 5, 6, 7, 8 years? If you go back and listen to Donald Trump give interviews in the 1990s and then compare that to him giving interviews while running for president in 2016, it is very clear that 2016 Trump was quite diminished relative to 1998 Trump. That 2016 Trump then did go on to be president for 4 years. So a lot of the voters who might vote for him again, right, sort of accept the idea that, 2016 Trump was capable of being president. So then the question is, how different is 2024 Trump from 2016 Trump, right? So it's like, yeah, he rambles, he gets names wrong, he says sentences that don't make sense, but he did that in 2016 too. Has he really changed that much? Whereas the issue for Biden, I think, is that he seems more diminished relative to a prior status quo than does Trump, I think.
It boils down to Trump seems crazy and Biden seems frail, and America prefers crazy a lot of the time.
I worry that this election is shaping up into a contest between the unfit and the unwell. And those are two different things. I see Trump as unfit for office for reasons that have nothing to do with his age or the way he speaks on the stump or his rambling. It's because of his character and his actions and his beliefs. But if Trump's unfitness is about who he is, Biden's is about who he's becoming. It's hard to say that he's been unfit for the job so far. I think he's governed reasonably well in this first term. The question for us, not for us as like podcast hosts, the question for us as voters, right, is whether projecting Biden forward, we think he will remain well enough to endure the rigors of this incredibly demanding job. So yesterday I watched just a couple of his public events from 2020, 3.5 years ago. And I have to say he looked sharper and quicker, significantly so back then. And I was, Evan Osnos wrote a good book about Biden in 2020. And when Osnos asked Biden about the age issue back then, he put it in a way that was, I think, apropos for today. He said, I asked Biden how he would respond if opponents say he was too old to be president. I think it's totally legitimate for people to raise it, he said. And I'll just say, look at me, decide. He's basically saying, like, it's the eye test, right? Like, you'll know when you see it. And the eye test isn't going well for him lately.
Well, and it's also that, I mean, the crucial element here is that Biden has a vice president who is seen as less competent than he is, who is seen as more left-wing than he is, and who would not, as far as we can tell, be someone that most Americans would want to be president. So Biden is presenting himself as someone who may or may not be too frail for the job, but regardless of whether he's too frail for the job, the literal worry is that he's just very likely to become incapacitated if he takes a further step down or to actually die. And everything here would be different if Biden's vice president was seen as popular and moderate and a safe choice for the Democrats. I think that's just an underlying reality here.
On the campaign trail, Nikki Haley has been kind of explicitly campaigning on a vote for Biden is a vote for a President Harris. And that actually has a disturbing resonance. Like, people have a gut level reaction to that on the campaign trail that we could parse all day long. But you're not wrong.
I have a gut level reaction to that.
It's not like she's some flaming revolutionary. I find it fascinating.
Yeah, she's a former prosecutor.
She's a prosecutor. I mean, the progressives weren't happy about it to some degree. So it is fascinating, just the level of that.
Who has presented herself in her entire presidential incarnation as a voice who never deviates from whatever the progressive line happens to be, who has made no effort to present
we could do a Kamala episode another time. But
I will retreat from my critique, but only to say that I think you cannot underrate how important this element is to the particular fix that we're all in.
I think that's right. But I also think that, we don't yet know who Trump's VP is going to be and how that's going to sort of affect the race overall.
It's going to be me. I can break the news today that I have been asked and accepted.
Well, I'm definitely not voting for him.
Safe hands.
All right. Well, we'll have to talk more about Ross's ascendancy to the VP slot in another episode when we come back, hot and cold. And finally, it's time for Hot Cold, where every week one of us shares something we're into, over, or somewhere in between. So, who's got the hot cold this week?
It's me.
It's me.
Why you sound so hot on it?
Well, no, because
so sad.
I'm the problem.
This is Fonzie jumping the shark a little bit, maybe with hot cold. I fear I'm venturing into Andy Rooney territory.
Venture.
And I'm willing to be dissuaded on this point, but I am cold on countdown clocks. There is an excess of stuff in my life that has countdown clocks, and they're starting to stress me out a little bit. And this has become very apparent to me just in the last few weeks. Before a major sporting event, such as, the Super Bowl, you have the countdown to kickoff. Now, if I'm the kind of person who's watching hours of Super Bowl pregame commentary...
Hypothetically.
Yes, hypothetically. Not that I would be, but if I were that person, chances are I'm also the kind of person who knows when kickoff is. I don't need the countdown clock. There are countdown clocks to tell me exactly how many seconds I have to wait for the online ad to finish. If there's an ad. I'll live with it. I'll be fine. I don't need to know that there's like 12 seconds left before I can enjoy the thing I want to enjoy. What really got me thinking about this was the coverage of the Iowa caucuses on CNN last month. Their panelists were discussing what might happen in Iowa like all day long. And they had an official on-screen clock counting down not to when the caucuses began, but to when CNN's official coverage from Iowa would begin at 4 p.m. And then at 4 p.m., they began another countdown clock, counting down the 4 hours until the caucuses actually started. This seems insane, and I got very upset just sort of staring at that new 4-hour countdown clock. The proliferation of the clocks, of the countdowns, makes it feel like there's this inexorable tick-tock, tick-tock, tick-tock all the time. Like I'm always counting something down. It makes it harder for me to just be in the moment and not always be counting to the next thing.
Stop all the clocks. Cut off the telephone. Prevent the dog from barking.
Time doesn't bother me. Countdowns.
I think this is an objection to time itself, Carl.
Yeah.
Keeps on ticking, ticking, ticking.
There must be market research that tells everyone that these things are popular, that people like these things, or that it creates a sense of urgency surrounding whatever they're trying to sell us.
Well, I feel like there's a different... The countdown clock on the YouTube ads, it's keeping you there. I feel like the clocks on cable news especially, but also the NFL and so on, are hapless attempts to preserve a dying medium.
They want you to be excited. If it's counting down, it must be counting down to something
excited to watch
really
the Super Bowl.
excited.
I don't need a countdown clock telling me it's like 4 hours and 57 minutes away.
I'll tell you
I
what.
warned you.
I'm going to be counting down till the next time I get to talk to all of you.
Oh, nice. Happy President's Day.
Happy President's Day.
Take our discussion of presidents and let it guide your way through President's Day.
Have a good week, guys.
See you guys. Bye. Thanks for joining our conversation. If you liked it, be sure to follow Matter of Opinion on your favorite podcast app. And let us know what big question you think we should talk about next by emailing us at matterofopinion@nytimes.com. Matter of Opinion is produced by Derek Arthur, Sophia Alvarez-Boyd, and Phoebe Lett. It is edited by Jordana Hochman. Our fact-check team is Kate Sinclair, Mary Marge Locker, and Michelle Harris. Original music by Isaac Jones, Efim Shapiro, Carol Saburo, Sonia Herrero, and Pat McCusker. Mixing by Carol Saburo. Audience strategy by Shannon Busta and Christina Samuelewski. Our executive producer is Annie Rose Strasser.